Hi, David here, and welcome back to the channel, where we're looking at the teaching of divine love through the automatic writings of the early 20th century medium, James Padgett. The first thing I need to do is to apologise for the lack of videos in recent weeks, which a number of you have commented on, thank you. I had a severe flu prior to Christmas, which left me with a dry cough that kicked in every time I tried to speak. So that ruled out doing any audio or video recordings for a while. So this video should have been out before Christmas, but we're now into a new year. Happy New Year, everyone. And looking forward to Easter. And as you'll see, that is very appropriate for the message we're looking at in today's video. In the last Sunday video, 10:15, we looked at a message given through James Padgett from Jesus, explaining that true faith only exists where there is a sharing in the divine love of God, and that it cannot exist where there is merely mental belief based upon mental conviction, belief in an idea. That's an important point to take on board. So if you haven't yet seen that video, do go back and take a look at it. I'll add a link to it at the end of this video and in the description box. A couple of weeks after that message from Jesus, James Padgett received a message from the Apostle Luke on October 24, 1915, which is the message we're going to be looking at today. The reason I said it was appropriate to be thinking about Easter is because in this message, Luke addresses the question of what happened to Jesus' physical body after his death. In the New Testament narratives, it is simply stated that the tomb was found empty when it was opened, after his father Joseph had arranged for his body to be placed in it. There are slight variations on the story depending upon which manuscripts you're translating, but essentially the question of what happened to Jesus' physical form is left as a mystery. After the discovery of the empty tomb came the resurrection appearances, when Jesus met with his followers after his death. The body Jesus was using during those reappearances seems to have been slightly different from the physical form people around him were familiar with. Some of those who met him did not immediately recognize him, which they surely would if he had been using the same body, battered and bruised though it was. So, are the New Testament accounts of the resurrection appearances to be relied upon? If they are, was it the same or a different body that Jesus was animating? If it was a different body, where did it come from? And what happened to the old one? These are questions, among many others, that have been debated endlessly over the past 2,000 years. And in this message to James Padgett, Luke makes a start on answering some of them. As I've mentioned before, Luke did not know Jesus personally during his earthly life. So he, like us, has learned from others the details of what happened. And he reminds us of this in the message. Luke worked closely with Paul after Jesus' death. What Luke has to say is extremely challenging, simply because it describes things that lie well beyond most people's experience of how this world works. So to try and bridge that gap, I will be drawing on some of the things that I have experienced as a medium, or which I know about through observing the work of other mediums. The only other thing to mention is that this message was given to James Padgett after he attended a spiritualist meeting, and Luke ends the message saying that he accompanied Padgett to that meeting. From what Luke says, it seems that something discussed at the meeting prompted Luke to try and clear up the mystery of what happened to Jesus' body after it was placed in the tomb. So let's get into the message. Luke begins as follows. I am here, St. Luke. I was with you tonight at the meeting of the spiritualists and heard the statement of the speaker as to the probabilities of what became of the body of Jesus after the crucifixion. I was not present at the crucifixion and, of course, do not personally know what became of the body of Jesus, though I have been told by those who were present that the Bible's description of his burial in the tomb of Joseph was true, Matthew 27:60. The body was buried in the tomb of Joseph and left there by those who placed it in the tomb, which was sealed, and a guard set over it to prevent anyone from approaching and interfering with the body. Matthew 27:65. Because Jesus had predicted that in 3 days he would rise again. Matthew 20:19. So far, so good. The mention of that prediction by Jesus is interesting. There are several messages from Jesus making it clear that his arrest and execution were not things he predicted, although he was well aware of some of the risks he ran in challenging the authority of the Jewish priests, at least as they saw it. From what Luke says here, however, it does seem that Jesus' knowledge of the processes around death enabled him to say that as and when he did die, he would make a reappearance, and that this would be on the 3rd day. There are other predictions attributed to Jesus in the New Testament that Jesus says he did not make, but from what Luke says here, Jesus had told his disciples that they would see him after his physical death. We'll take a closer look in future videos at what Jesus did and didn't predict. Anyway, to get back to Luke's message, he continues, after the tomb was sealed, Jesus arose, and without his body of flesh, passed from the tomb and descended into the lower spheres of the spirit world, where the dark spirits lived in their ignorance and sufferings, and he preached to them the rebestowal of the gift of redemption. This is interesting. The way this is often translated in the New Testament is by saying that Jesus descended to the spirits in prison and spoke to them. The only prison in spirits is the prison of our own thoughts and beliefs. The only thing that ever holds us back is our existing state of spiritual development. Yet the conditions that our thoughts and memories can hold us in are real and can feel like a prison to those who endure them. So Jesus takes the opportunity to share his knowledge of the divine love of God with those in spirit, where he now is, who most need to hear this message. So in the immediate aftermath of his execution, in a horrific manner, and before the resurrection appearances, here Jesus is, back at work. And in telling us this, Luke also explains for us what is meant by saying Jesus visited the spirits who were in prison. So, Jesus has left his physical body and the tomb behind. Luke continues, the body of flesh, by the power which Jesus possessed, became so spiritualized or etherealized that its component parts became disseminated by Jesus in the surrounding atmosphere. and he retained only the spiritual body, in which he appeared afterwards to the disciples and others. When he appeared at the meeting of the apostles, where Thomas, the doubter, was present, he recalled to his form, as you will better understand by my using such expression, elements of the material, so that in appearance the body was much like flesh and blood, as when it was placed in the tomb, before he disseminated these elements, as I have said. So Luke is telling us two things here. The first thing is that Jesus consciously dissipated his discarded physical form. The second thing is that Jesus then drew to himself, to his spiritual body, physical matter drawn from this world, so that he would have a visible appearance with substance, meaning he could be touched and felt. The first of these, the ability to disperse physical items, is something that we know people in spirit have the expertise to do. We don't see physical phenomena associated with Western mediumship to quite the extent that we used to, although it seems to be the direction my own mediumship is heading in. But there is a history of what are called apports, where an item is dispersed in one location and reconstituted in another. What Luke describes is the first part of this process, where the matter of which a physical item is made is dispersed into its constituent elements. At the time when Jesus does this, his old physical form is simply that, a physical item he has no further use for. This is important not only because it tells us what happened to Jesus' physical body, but because it reminds us that although we retain a spiritual appearance at death, a spiritual body, there is no resurrection or reanimation of the physical body, which is something many people have believed in down the centuries. If Jesus had not dispersed his old physical form, it would have decayed in the usual way. Essentially, all he did was speed up that process. The second thing Luke tells us about is a process whereby Jesus attracted to himself, to his spiritual body, matter drawn from the physical world, so that his spiritual body would have visible substance, if only temporarily. There is a long history of materializations in spiritualism which involve exactly this process of drawing matter from the physical world in order to reconstitute an appearance that can be seen and occasionally touched if the materialization is sufficiently complete. Obviously, such a phenomenon is vulnerable to imitation, especially where someone is claiming to do it for commercial or monetary reasons. It is nevertheless something that is truly possible. Speaking from my own experience as a medium, it is difficult to explain in words just how solid the energy can be when you sit for spirit. There is something there that feels very real, very present, but I can only take other people's word for it as to what they see visually, and I rely upon those in spirit working with me to make things happen. Where Jesus takes this process further is in doing it consciously, and in doing it so that he can be seen in normal daylight and for a very extended duration, because the resurrection appearances span several days. So we definitely have something to explore, and there is more said about this in other messages, which I hope we'll get to. But most of this message from Luke is concerned with explaining why there was an empty tomb, why the physical body was not there when it was opened. He continues, "The flesh and blood which encloses the spirit form of man is continually changing in obedience to the ordinary laws of nature as understood by man. Jesus understood and had power to call into operation other laws of nature, which caused such laws to operate, that the dissemination of the elements of flesh and blood took place, and he was left only with the spirit form. This, I know, has been a great mystery since the time of the discovery of the absence of his body by the watchman at his tomb. Now, being such a mystery, and as the only explanation of such a disappearance, men have believed and taught that his body of flesh and blood actually arose from the dead, and therefore the physical body of flesh and blood of mortals will also arise in what they call the Great Resurrection Day. No body of flesh and blood arose, and the spirit form of Jesus did not remain in the tomb after the dissemination of the material body, for no tomb or other place could confine his spirit. You will remember that on the third day, Jesus appeared to Mary, Mary of Magdala, who was most intimate and familiar with the appearance of Jesus, and yet she did not recognize him, and thought he was the gardener, recounted in John 20:15. And so it was with the disciples who were traveling with him to Emmaus. We know from another message James Padgett received that it was a bit risky for people associated with Jesus to be hanging around after his execution. So some of them laid low, others made themselves scarce by relocating. The reason Jesus went after them is because he realized that if the community was dispersed, everyone might lose heart, and what he had taught might be lost altogether. In Luke 24:13 in the New Testament, there is the story of Jesus rounding up disciples who were traveling away from Jerusalem. One of the interesting things in that story, of course, is that they didn't recognize him. In the message from Luke to James Padgett, Luke says, "Now, if he had retained his body of flesh and blood, do you not suppose that they would have recognized him? For if he had the power to resume that physical body into which Thomas had thrust his hand and found it to be a body in the appearance of flesh and blood, then why do you think it strange or wonderful that he would have had the power to cast off his earthly body while in the tomb and cause it to disappear into thin air?" So essentially what Luke is saying here is, if people are willing to believe in the resurrection of the physical body, why do they find it so hard to accept that Jesus had the know-how to disperse his physical body and resume a physical form that could be seen and touched, as Thomas did? Part of the reason Luke is making this point is because when the message was given 100 years ago, a belief in the resurrection of the physical body was much more widespread in Western culture than it is now. So Luke is working to get people away from that idea and towards accepting that Jesus dispersed his old physical form as no longer needed. He continues, "This, I am informed, is the true explanation of the disappearance of the physical body of Jesus. And to me, and to others who understand the physical laws of nature, I mean that nature that is beyond the ken of men, it is not surprising or worthy to be deemed a mystery." Luke then signs off his message, saying to James Padgett, "I am glad that I went with you to the meeting tonight, as I became impressed with the desirability of making this great mystery a mystery no longer. With all my love, I am your brother in Christ." St. Luke. So, interesting stuff with plenty of food for thought and dealing with themes that we will be picking up on again. The next video in this sequence, video 1017, which will be uploaded next Sunday, flus and coughs permitting, will look at a message from Jesus in which he explains the importance of developing the soul perceptions. The material mind is used to handling information that comes to it through the 5 physical senses. So relying on it to perceive spiritual things is to miss a rather obvious point. The development of our soul perceptions is necessary in order to perceive spiritual matters. In most of us, the ability to do that exists only in potential. The next midweek video, 217, also delayed, will look at a message to James Padgett from Frank Davis, who was a childhood friend of James's, who shares some of his experiences since passing to spirit. And it's followed by a very short message from James's wife, Helen, commenting upon it. So do join me for one or both of those videos. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this one, do please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It all helps to spread knowledge of this material, so it's good to join in the sharing. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, God willing. Take care until then. Bye-bye.